It's being billed as a decisive moment in Moscow's relationship with African countries. In the next half hour, we'll take an in-depth look at this week's Russia-Africa summit. What's at stake for the Kremlin? What will top the agenda for African leaders gathered in St. Petersburg? We'll bring you reporting and analysis. Straight Talk Africa starts now. Hello there and welcome to Straight Talk Africa. I'm Haydé Adams. How much does Russia really invest in Africa? And can a country mired in a protracted war facing over 300 sanctions have the political will and the economic means to be a reliable trade and investment partner to African countries? Well, those are just some of the questions that will take center stage as African leaders gather in St. Petersburg on Thursday and Friday for the Russia-Africa Summit. Also on the agenda, trade, security, arms and grain supplies. As the Associated Press put it, the Russian government is under new pressure to show its commitment to a continent of 1.3 billion people that is increasingly assertive on the global stage. So what is at stake for Russian leaders and their African counterparts during the summit? VOA's Mariama Diallo has more.
The event will focus on enhancing cooperation in such areas as development, security and peace, even as Moscow persists in its aggression against Ukraine. International summits involve an element of political theater, analysts say, and African attendance will be a measure of success for the St. Petersburg gathering.
So I think there'll be a lot of focus on who attends. And last time in 2019, when the world looked very different, before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there were 43 African heads of state that went to Sochi for the 2019 summit.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to higher food and oil prices for many African nations.
They're under a lot of pressure with what's happening in Ukraine and the ramifications of the conflict there, which is commodity prices, particularly for Africans, but also everything that is happening with Wagner and so on. So this is an opportunity for Russia to try to assert its place on the global stage as well.
And trade will likely be a major topic of discussion.
I think there will be talk about trade. Russia's trade with Africa is really negligible. China and the EU are by far much bigger trading partners with Africa.
Russia is also looking to get around sanctions imposed by the US and its allies.
No African countries have imposed sanctions on Russia, and so it's a lucrative market for it. We saw a similar pattern after the invasion of Georgia in 2008 and the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. As Western markets closed to Russian business, they sought markets elsewhere. And of course, Africa, Latin America, Asia were areas where they did seek to expand.
The UN General Assembly in February passed a resolution demanding that Russia end the war and leave Ukrainian territory. While 141 countries voted in favor, 2 African countries voted against it and 15 abstained.
I mean, Russia benefited from that. In the sense that it showed them like they have friends. It's simply an awakening on the African part, but particularly sending a message to the rest of the world that we also have our own foreign policies, and those reflect our interests, our national interests.
Dizolele adds, however, that the optics of one country summoning the leaders of an entire continent undermines Africa's efforts to assert itself on the global stage. Mariama Diallo, VOA News, Nairobi.
Well, for more now, I'm joined here in studio by Danila Galperovich. He's a broadcast journalist within VOA's Russia News Service. Danila, always great to have you here on Straight Talk Africa. Thanks for coming back. What is at stake here for Vladimir Putin at this Russia-Africa summit? Is this really the decisive moment that everybody is talking about?
More or less, because, of course, 54 countries of Africa is 54 countries in United Nations General Assembly, and as we know from previous votings, Russia enjoyed neutrality or even support from some African countries in its aggression against Ukraine. So, of course, to show that Russia is not isolated, to show that leaders are still coming, and especially African leaders, for Russia it is important. Also important to push this so-called anti-colonial agenda, which Putin is trying to promote, despite that, of course, many experts say that his war against Ukraine is exactly a colonial war. So, yes, for him, in many ways, it is a decisive moment, and many people predicted that probably African countries will be kind of angry on Putin because of his withdrawal from grain deal, but other experts say, and I agree with them, that probably even more African countries need to come to St. Petersburg to speak with Putin about future of food security.
So how do these kinds of summits go, especially knowing Russia? You've reported on this for many, many years. You know how Vladimir Putin operates, how he deals with other nations, especially those from the developing regions of the world. What's the style, the tone, and what tends to be the outcomes of these kinds of summits?
Of course, he's trying to be as friendly as possible and to resemble all Soviet-style approach as much as possible. And I can tell you that I never had reports previously from St. Petersburg that the city is closed completely. The governor of the city, Alexander Beglov, recommended for the businesses and for state enterprises, for people to stay home, to work from home. And I covered G8 at that time in St. Petersburg and G20 in St. Petersburg. It's never been like that. So, of course, the security is now really, really tight. At the same time, of course, Kremlin is upset with the number of highest leaders from Africa, because if in 2019 it was more than 40 of them, now it's only 17 heads of state. And Kremlin is saying that it was direct pressure from United States, France, and other countries through diplomatic channels to, how to say, curb the presence of on a high level. But at the same time, of course, St. Petersburg and Putin himself will treat them like guests, friends, and so on. That's why they cleaned the city.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. Now, with the war raging in Ukraine, an ICC warrant out for his arrest, a mutiny behind him, I mean, that is a lot hanging over Putin's head. But what kind of figure does Vladimir Putin now cut at a summit that he's presiding over? I mean, what kind of image will and can he project?
His image now is no doubt controversial, because despite that Kremlin trying to push the narrative that everything is under control, that army and the people suppressed the mutiny of Prigozhin, everybody knew, and we discussed it with you before, that Prigozhin was actually welcomed on the south of Russia and so on. So Putin not as much in control as he was before. And still, with this summit especially, he's trying to show that no, he's in control, and even with his withdrawal from the grain deal, he can have some leverage to speak with other countries. So he's still trying to play this macho style, still trying to be a figure on the diplomatic scene.
Now, we know a lot of these summits, whether they are in Russia or elsewhere, are often notorious for a lot of promises and pledges made and then very little delivered on later. Again, knowing Putin, how he operates, how he deals with international partners, what is the most, in your view, that African leaders can expect to leave with?
Of course, those countries which are already connected with Russia in security matters and so on, they want reassurance that even if Wagner leave, probably some military advisors, security advisors will stay, or some forces will stay. And I see that the countries like Mali, Central African Republic, and others will speak with Kremlin about. And we see that they already getting this. I mean, immediately after Prigozhin's coup, it was mutiny. It was diplomatic exchanges between these countries and Moscow on this subject. Also, just recently, the Secretary of Russian Security Council, Mr. Patrushev, he said that despite the sanctions and so on, Russia is supplying African countries with grain, with food and everything. So I think the reassurance that it will continue, that's what some African countries at least will receive in St. Petersburg.
Well, no doubt that summit's going to be watched here in Washington, of course, not just by the powers that be, but of course by us. We'll keep a keen eye on what comes out of this summit. Thank you so much, Danila Galperovich from VOA's Russian News Service. I do appreciate your time. Do stay with us here on Straight Talk Africa. Still ahead, what does Russia's political, economic and military footprint in Africa really look like? How does its trade relationship with the continent compare to that of the European Union, China and the United States? My guests are standing by. We'll be back in a moment.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
You're watching VOA's Red Carpet. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Thank you so much for joining us each week right here on Red Carpet. We bring you the latest in You're with Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. Our focus is the Russia-Africa Summit taking place in St. Petersburg beginning on Thursday, as well as the scope and scale of Russia's engagement with the African continent. Take a look here at the numbers from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. It shows that Russia contributes less than 1% of the $83 billion in total foreign direct investment that goes to the African continent. Its economic engagements on the continent are mainly trade-based. That's to the tune of about $14 billion. That's relatively small compared to the African trade with other major partners like the European Union, China and the United States. And Russia's exports to Africa are 7 times the level of African exports to the Eastern European country. They comprise grains, weapons, extractives and nuclear power. And over 70% of all of Russia's trade with the continent is directed towards these 4 countries: Egypt, Morocco, Algeria and South Africa. Just wanted to give you a little bit of a clue there. Now, here to discuss Russia's engagement with Africa is Vanda Felbab-Brown. She's a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, and Paul Nantulya is a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Paul and Vanda, great pleasure to have both of you here on the show. A warm welcome to you. And Paul, I'm going to start out with you here. This summit is being billed in the international media as a decisive moment for Russia-Africa relations. Do you agree with that assessment? And what is most at stake for whom here?
Well, I don't really know what's meant by decisive. If it's decisive for Russia, then yes, because Russia has every incentive to try and demonstrate to the West, in particular, that it is still able to conduct international relations and still has an extensive circle of friends around the world, despite the fact that it is facing sanctions. Secondly, President Putin, in particular, would like to demonstrate that all is well and good in Russia, despite the failed mutiny by the Wagner Group, by Prigozhin, and that all is well. So these are the two elements I think that will be critical for the Kremlin. So I think it will be decisive for Russia. I really don't see it as being decisive for African countries.
Interesting. Vanda, this is being called a showcase summit for Russia. What does Russia, a country at war facing over 300 sanctions amongst other problems, what does it actually have to showcase? And what do you expect will dominate discussions?
Well, Russia actually comes into the summit with very little. And at the moment when it has alienated African countries by withdrawing from the grain deal, that has already caused shortages of supply around the world, but also to Africa specifically, and of course caused inflation and food prices to go up. Now, despite all the rhetoric that this is the decisive moment, the Emperor Russia comes to the summit with very little clothes on. For over a decade, Russia has postured in Africa that it is an alternative, even a replacement to the United States. And it has, in fact, maintained a very explicitly anti-Western, anti-American foreign policy in Africa. Yet on the economic front, on the technological front, and even increasingly on the security front, it delivers much less than it promises.
Paul, if we look at Russia's share of all the foreign direct investment that goes to Africa, compared to the kind of influence that it wields on the continent, would you say there's a disconnect there? I mean, is Russia getting away with investing very little relatively in Africa and wielding outsized influence?
That's exactly how I would put it, because two-way trade is between anywhere between 14 and 17, 14 billion and 17 billion. Compare that with China, which is approaching 270 billion. I mean, Russia punches way above its weight when it comes to weapon sales, when it comes to security. The kind of security activities it conducts on the continent through mercenaries like the Wagner Group, and the sale of surveillance equipment and police and military equipment. I think that's really where the center of gravity is with regard to Russian engagement. On the economic front, on the trade front, when we look at areas like human resource development, I mean, the Chinese are training over 100,000 Africans every 3 years. That was before COVID. Russia does not come anywhere close to that. So I think this is more in terms of what African countries are going to take away from this summit. I think it's probably going to be, like one of your guests on the show said, is really going to be on the security front. I don't see much by the way of economic and trade deals, as well as human resource development. I just don't see it.
Vanda, Paul brought us beautifully to the subject of Wagner. The summit comes weeks after that short-lived mutiny we saw in Moscow, and that, of course, had or appeared to have repercussions about the future of the Wagner mercenary group's activities in some African countries. We're seeing in Central African Republic, for example, reports of a contingent of Wagner forces arriving ahead of a crucial referendum there next week. President Faustin Archange Touadéra looking to abolish term limits in his country. How has what happened in Moscow affected Wagner's resources and capabilities in places like Central African Republic, Sudan and Mali?
Well, we are, of course, still very much seeing how the Wagner mutiny is going to play out. It hasn't fully played out in the repercussions within Russia itself, which in my view still holds a lot of desire to get much tougher with key leaders such as Prigozhin. Nonetheless, early predictions that we would see wholesale dismantling or pulling out of the Wagner Group from Africa and the Middle East has certainly not happened. We have seen some redeployments, and particularly in places where the relationship between the mutineers and deployments in Africa and Syria and Middle East have been strongest, like in Syria. Some Wagner groups have been arrested, detained, and flown down to Moscow. So there have been purges, and in my view, it's very likely that more purges will take place to tighten Kremlin's control over Wagner deployments, but we haven't seen any dismantling of Wagner. And in fact, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, was very quickly very explicit that Wagner in Africa was going to stay, that these operations are not going to be dismantled. I would also point out that some of the African countries that have signed up with Wagner, like Mali, like Central African Republic, have really very few options, especially after Mali asked France to leave, after it asked UN peacekeeping forces to leave. It is essentially stuck with Wagner, however weak, ineffective, and often counterproductive Wagner is in its operations.
Paul, I want to come back to the summit with you. The Kremlin came out on Tuesday, 2 days before this St. Petersburg gathering, accusing the West of trying to sabotage the summit by pressuring African nations not to attend. Are they right in that accusation?
Well, I think that statement by the Kremlin basically shows you what Russia sees when it comes to this summit, or when it comes to summits of this kind with African countries. I think what the Kremlin leadership really looks at is the numbers, right? So you look at 54, 55 countries equals 55 votes. Those 55 votes in the UN General Assembly constitute 27%. It's the single largest voting bloc at the United Nations, right? So that's what Russia looks like. That's what Russia looks at. And given that Russia-related resolutions are going to be coming up, over the next several months and years, Russia will want to secure as many of those as possible, right? So if the numbers are dropping, from 43 leaders in 2019 to 17 leaders, it is unsurprising that Russia would try to find a reason to explain the drop, this precipitous drop in leadership. And just to put it in perspective, if you look at what China, on the other hand, is able to pull off, since 2015, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation Summit has become the biggest multilateral event in the world for African countries. More African countries attend POCAC summits than the UN General Assembly, which is the world's biggest forum. So again, when you just compare Russia and China, you can really see the wide gap, the wide difference. I mean, it's really huge. And so definitely the Kremlin will be very unhappy that it is unable to, to host more than 17, say 20 leaders from Africa at the most. That's where that complaint comes from.
Right, the numbers are telling here. But just a quick follow-up for you, Paul. Are you sensing, by any degree, some sort of war fatigue amongst African countries?
Well, that's hard to tell. That's very hard to tell, because even those countries that they're kind of sitting on the fence, I mean, they're still abstaining, and there's still a general reluctance on the part of most African countries to really take a firm stand. And some scholars have put that down to ideological concerns, ideological ties with Russia. I mean, many African countries look at Russia as the legitimate inheritor of the legacy of the Soviet Union, which was very engaged on the African continent in the anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggles. But then you also have another community of scholars and analysts on the African continent that are basically saying Putin's Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's very, very different. In fact, Putin himself has criticized the Bolsheviks. He has made his views very clear about people like Vladimir Lenin, who are still lionized by African, the generation of Africans that grew up in the anti-colonial struggles. So it's a very dicey situation, and it's difficult to see how African countries are going to continue to kind of balance that. I think we're living in very interesting times.
Indeed. Vanda, we see the United States has begun imposing sanctions on top Malian officials over their alleged ties to the Wagner Group. How can some of these African countries be weaned off their reliance or dependence on the Wagner Group? You mentioned earlier that there are so few options for African countries, but is sanctioning the best approach?
Well, I think there are a few options for countries that have wholesale signed up with the Wagner Group, right? The Wagner Group is a competition with the United States and with the West, and how they have traditionally provided counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, anti-militancy assistance. The big difference with the way Russia does it is that it imposes no conditions with respect to human rights, with respect to democracy, with respect to civilian deaths. While the Western package would cause collateral damage, very controversial collateral damage, it was often done despite the rules and restrictions that were in place. Russia explicitly embracing themselves via the Wagner Group's brutality über alles. And more than that, it not only sells a very brutal campaign against insurgents, it also sells a secondary, but really now the dominant role for the Wagner Group, which is as a Praetorian guard to governments in power. But it is not the only game in town. And the sanctions, including the latest sanctions that have been imposed on some Mali leaders, are really making the choice much more stark for African countries. It's no longer just a desire, just the diplomatic pressure not to sign up with Wagner. Now it is very explicitly linked to a whole set of consequences in the economic and legal domain.
Paul, we've got just over a minute here. Just a final question for you here. We know that South Africa has been under pressure, of course, over its relationship with the Kremlin. If you look at Pretoria's relationship with Moscow and other leaders on the African continent who have ties to the Kremlin, and some who are willing to pay whatever other price there is for that, are there any other countries that Russia will be looking to woo during this summit? You know, nations that might, or leaders that might be on the diplomatic fence about going all in with and for Russia?
Haydé, that's a great question. Yes, there are some countries. I mean, Russia, or more specifically the Kremlin, has been working very, very hard to cultivate Kenya, to cultivate the new administration in Kenya. So I think you can expect to see some serious outreach on that front. Countries like Nigeria as well, you know, that punch way above their weight when it comes to African Union matters, has also had a change of government. So you're going to see that. I suspect there'll be efforts to woo and cultivate Zambia. Zambia has also had a change of administration, and it has always been historically very strongly aligned with Russia and with China. So I think you're going to see, you know, South Africa is not the only country, right, that the Kremlin is really keeping its sights on to ensure that it's able to keep you know, certain African countries in its corner as much as possible. So like I said, it comes down to numbers, it comes down to influence, it comes down to votes. That is what Russia is looking at.
Numbers, influence and votes, and we will definitely be keeping an eye on what comes out of this Russia-Africa summit. For now, Vanda Felbab-Brown and Paul Nantulya, thank you so much to both of you for your insights and your great analysis. I appreciate your time. And that is where we will leave it for this week. Find and follow us on social media. You can, of course, get more of the latest news from across the African continent on voaafrica.com. So from all of us here at Straight Talk Africa, thank you for always watching and thank you for always listening. And I will see you next time. For me, it's goodbye.